Jonah.
I am super excited for this series because growing up in the church, Jonah was always one of my favorite stories as a little boy because, of course, nowhere else in Scripture is there this giant fish that eats somebody. And to my knowledge, nowhere else in Scripture is a human being actually vomited out of another creature. So as a little kid, I just ate this up, no pun intended. I'm very excited to be in this book. We're working slowly through the story of Jonah. And so if you have a Bible and you want to open up to Jonah chapter 1, beginning in verse 1, we'll kick off there again today. Last week, Robert covered verses 1 and 2. Today, we're going to talk about verse 3, which means if we keep this pace up, we're going to be in Jonah for the next 6 years. No. It's one of these stories that has so much for us to learn and understand. We're calling the series Jonah and the Cautionary Whale because we really do see it as a cautionary tale for each and every one of us. There's so many mistakes Jonah makes that we can learn from and hopefully not reproduce his mistakes and reproduce his consequences, but be able to learn from it and to live lives that are honoring to God. And so we're looking at Jonah chapter 1, beginning in verse 1. It says, "The word of the Lord came to Jonah, son of Amittai. Go to the great city of Nineveh and preach against it, because its wickedness has come up before me." And then in verse 3 it says, "But Jonah ran away from the Lord and headed for Tarshish. He went down to Joppa, where he found a ship bound for that port. After paying the fare, he went aboard and sailed for Tarshish to flee from the Lord." When I read this story, it always makes me think of my older brother Jeremy, because he too was eaten by a large fish. Ironically, he does work on a submarine in the Navy, which is kind of like being in the belly of a large fish, but that's irrelevant. Now, it makes me think of my brother Jeremy, because Jeremy, as a kid, was the most stubborn kid ever. And you're like, oh, no, I know some pretty stubborn kids. No. Jeremy had just the strongest will. Like, if there was an international competition for who could be the most stubborn, Jeremy would have held the title from like 1978 till he probably grew out of it around maybe, the mid-90s or something like that. And if ever he didn't win, he would never admit defeat because he was just so stubborn. And my dad loves to tell this story, and it was actually before I was born, but Jeremy was like 3 or 4 years old. He was very young. He was able to, speak and string sentences together and all of that, but he was still quite young. And back then, 30 years ago, I grew up in a Baptist church. In Baptist churches, there were 2 services on Sunday. And I don't mean 2 services in the sense that we have 4 where you pick one. No, there's like a morning service and a night service, and you went to both of them. And so the schedule was always the same on Sundays. You wake up, you eat breakfast, you go to church, you come home, you eat a big lunch, you take a nap, and then you go back to church and you do it all over again. And so on this particular Sunday, they gather around the table at lunchtime, and they're getting ready to eat. My parents turned to my brother Jeremy, and I also have 2 other siblings that were alive for this, and they were there as well at the table. And they turn to Jeremy and they say, "Jeremy, do you want to pray for your food?" And Jeremy's like, "No." And they're like, "Oh, well, you can't eat until you pray." He's like, "Okay." Like, "Well, we're gonna pray for our food, and we're gonna begin eating, but you can't eat until you pray." And he says, "Okay. You want to pray?" "No." "All right." So they prayed, they start eating. A few minutes goes by, and they're like, "Jeremy, you want to eat?" He's like, "Yeah." Like, "You want to pray?" "No." And they start wrapping up dinner, bringing out dessert. They're like, "Jeremy, you hungry?" He's like, "Yeah." Like, "You want to pray?" "No." he never got upset. He never cried. He never like threw a tantrum or anything like that. He was just very calm and collected, this firm resolve. And this was not the first time my brother showed this sort of stubbornness. So, at this point, it's not about praying for your food. My parents they can't let this strong-willed child win. And so they just refuse. And so once again, he's like, no, I don't want to. And then, it's nap time. They wake up from nap time. They're getting ready to go back to church. And like, Jeremy, do you want to eat? You hungry? He's like, yeah. Do you want to pray? No. I'm like, all right, we're going to church. So they put his dinner in the fridge and they go to church and they come back from church and now it's like 9 o'clock at night and he hasn't eaten since breakfast. And I'm like, Jeremy, you hungry? And he's like, yeah. Like, you want to pray? No. And my parents actually put him to bed hungry that night. It wasn't until the next morning at breakfast that he finally prayed. And my parents were so relieved because they didn't know how much longer they could keep it up. Like, eventually they have to feed the kid. Imagine if this happened today. CPS would have been called after like 30 minutes. But he was so stubborn that he was willing to go without food, go hungry for 24 hours. And this is a little kid. You know how kids get when they don't eat? But he was just stood firm, stood his ground because he was so stubborn. And when I look at this story of Jonah and I read it, I just see the spirit of my brother's stubbornness just jumping off of the pages. And I see Jonah and, God comes to him. God, the creator of the universe, comes to him and says, go to Nineveh. And he's like, no, not going to do it. I'm like, oh, that's Jeremy. And as I see this, and the writer of the story is so clever and so creative, and it's something that you don't actually see the fullness of it in the English translation. It really comes through in Hebrew, and I don't read Hebrew, so I don't know but I was able to read, some of the scholars and how they talk about the language, and the author does some really creative stuff to just show the contrast between, what God is calling Jonah to do, and Jonah's just firm refusal to go and do it. In the ancient world, much like today, they would kind of refer to heaven as up and hell below. And it wasn't that they thought that heaven was in the sky or hell was down in the earth, but they would just kind of use this sort of language to talk about it, much like we do. So, God was up and, we're down and all of that. And so the very first thing that God says to Jonah in the original Hebrew text, when he calls out Jonah, the very first thing he says to him is up. He says up. Like, get up. Go up to Nineveh. And then it says that Jonah refused and he runs to Tarshish. And then it says he went down to Joppa. And he got on a boat and he went down into the bottom of the boat. And then a storm came and he went down into the water. And then God sent a fish and he went down into the belly of the fish. And then, Jonah has this amazing prayer when he's in the belly of the whale, and he's kind of recounting the story and uses all of this imagery that kind of relates to like Sheol and Hades and just talking about going down to the depths. God says, jump, and Jonah says, how low? He just wants to get as far in the opposite direction from what God is asking him to do. He's so stubborn and he's willing to hold his ground at an extreme expense to himself. Where it says here that Jonah paid the fare for the ship to Tarshish. It's interesting. You know how a lot of languages, they have, masculine and feminine words. If you ever studied other languages, we don't really do this in the English. But in Hebrew, there's masculine and feminine words. And the word for boat is a feminine word. And when it talks about Jonah paying the fare, it says that Jonah paid her fare. And Hebrew scholars, they believe that if Jonah was just buying a ticket, buying a seat on the boat, it would actually use the masculine. It would have said he paid his fare. But because it says her, it most likely means that Jonah didn't just buy a ticket, buy a seat, that Jonah actually chartered this whole boat. That, a lot of early Hebrew scholars, they believe that Jonah probably sold everything he had to purchase this charter ship to Tarshish to get out of town because he was so stubborn, he was so unwilling to bend to God's will that he was willing to get rid of everything else just so he didn't have to do what God wanted him to do. He was so stubborn. And I don't know about you, but this is really hard for me to relate to because I'm not stubborn at all. And, my wife may disagree, and my coworkers and my family may all disagree, but they're wrong. I'm not stubborn. I'm just very passionate, and I have very strong convictions. And there's nothing you could say to convince me otherwise. But it really is interesting, because where does stubbornness end and conviction begin? They really are the same thing. But when we say stubborn, it sounds like a bad thing. And when we say passion and conviction, it sounds like a good thing. You know, being passionate and having strong convictions, that's good. Nobody wants to be wishy-washy. You know, nobody votes for the politician who's a flip-flopper. If you're a Mets fan, you have to stay a Mets fan. You can't just start rooting for the Yankees because the Mets are terrible. You can't just be a front runner. And we have this appreciation of passion and conviction. But what happens when our passion and our conviction butt up against a differing passion and conviction? How do we respond? And, you know, in most cases, I would argue that you probably want to defer to the one who's the authority on the subject. You know, like if you go to the doctor and you say, you know, I feel great, I'm doing excellent, and the doctor tells you that your cholesterol is through the roof and you have high blood pressure, you probably want to defer to his authority. Or if, you know, you take your car into the mechanic and you feel like, oh, you know, my car's just doing fine, and the mechanic points out all these things that are going wrong. I can't actually give you any specifics on that because I know nothing about cars. But he tells you, you know, something's wrong, and you should probably defer to the authority of the mechanic, unless you're at Jiffy Lube. Never defer to their authority. Every time I go there, they try to sell me a new filter for something. How many filters are in a car? Like, it's such a long list. Like, they get me at the air filter at the beginning. They go through the whole list, and then they got me at the air filter again at the bottom. And I'm just like, yeah, you could probably not defer to the Jiffy Lube guys. But in most cases, we want to defer to the one who has the authority in the situation. So what does that mean when our convictions butt up against God's convictions? Because God is always the authority on all subjects, period. And here we have Jonah, and he has a very strong conviction about something. He is very passionate about it. He doesn't want to bend. He's butting up against God. Do we bend to God's will, or do we run? And of course, I think we'd all immediately say, oh, of course we bend to God's will. But what if it's not as uncommon as we might think that we run? You know, looking at the story of Jonah, at the beginning of the story, it doesn't tell us what Jonah's issue is. It actually conspicuously kind of leaves it out. We find out in the end, but I think the author intentionally leaves it out at the beginning of the story because he doesn't want us to get hung up on Jonah's particular issue too soon. Because he wants us to ask the question, how does this relate to me? See, we all have different issues that we're passionate about, different convictions that we have that are more important to us. I've been married for about 9 months now, which means, you know, I'm pretty much an expert at this point, crushing it. But it's funny because Lindsay and I get along great, and like we really don't fight about much until it comes to like design issues. Like the very first fight we ever had was about like Christmas fest design stuff. Because when it comes to design, we're just both very passionate. We have our things that this vision of how it should be, and so we kind of butt heads and we'll fight and argue about these things. But we all have our different things that we are most passionate about, issues that we want to hold on to most. And for one person, it might be one thing. For another person, it might be another thing. And so the author, I think, leaves this blank so that if we can all relate and we can start to think about what are the issues that maybe I'm refusing to bend to God's will, where I'm holding on to my conviction, even if it's not God's. You know, the scriptures, they have a lot to say about sexuality and about what is right and proper. It's very clear that sex is for a man and a woman in the confines of marriage. What happens when your conviction is that, you know, sex is okay in a loving, committed relationship, even if they're not married, even if it's not a man and a woman? And what if that is your conviction? Will you hold on to that conviction even if God says that it should be otherwise? Or what about, marriage? God has this idea about marriage that it should be enduring. Jesus says that your yes should be yes, your no should be no. And when you make a vow to your husband or wife to love them and be committed to them till death, that it means till death, not until you get bored or until they stop loving you or until they stop being nice, that it means that it endures. What happens when your conviction says, marriage should make me happy? Do you submit to God's authority or do you choose your own way? The scriptures are also very clear about our finances. Like everything you have, everything you own is a gift from God, and God expects you to give generously to those who are in need, to be working toward the tithe of 10% to support the work that he's doing in this world. And what if your conviction is, I've worked hard for this money and I need this to survive? Do we bend to God's will or do we choose our own way? Jonah was confronted with a situation where he had to make the choice. Am I going to hold on to these convictions that I've had? Maybe he's had it his whole life. Or am I going to submit to God's authority? It's an important question for us to ask ourselves because being right comes at an enormous cost. You guys know this. If you've ever been in an argument with somebody, if you insist on being right, if you insist on getting your own way, it does damage to that relationship. And when we look at Jonah here in verse 3, Jonah, it says, ran away from the Lord and headed for Tarshish. Jonah, he wanted to hold his ground. He didn't want to do what God wanted him to do. He was stubborn and strong-willed, and he wanted to hold on to his convictions and be right. And so he ran away from the Lord. See, the price that Jonah paid to hold his ground, it wasn't just the price he paid for the bow. It cost him his nearness, his closeness to God. He ran from the presence of the Lord. This was very confusing for me as a child. I'm like, Jonah's a prophet. He should probably know that God's everywhere. Like, where are you going to run? This doesn't make sense. I kind of get this image in my head of, you ever play hide and seek with like a really little kid? And yeah, they hide in the same exact spot every time, and like half their body is hanging out, but because they can't see you, they just assume. And so Jonah's playing hide and seek with God, and God's just like, I see you, you idiot. Like, did Jonah miss that day of like prophet school or something, that God is everywhere? And surely he knew. Even David wrote in the Psalms, and this is before the time of Jonah, so Jonah would know the Psalm 139. Where can I go from your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence? He says, if I go up to the heavens, you are there. If I make my bed in the depths, you are there. If I rise on the wings of the dawn, if I settle on the far side of the sea, even there, your hand will guide me. God is everywhere. He's omnipresent, we say. He's everywhere. So where is Jonah going to run? See, at the same time, God might be present everywhere, but the experience of his presence isn't the same everywhere. And we see this right away in the beginning of scriptures. In Genesis 4, there's Cain and Abel. You guys familiar with the story of Cain and Abel? Cain kills his brother Abel, and so God banishes Cain into the land of Nod, east of Eden. And Cain cries out to God, this is more than I can bear to be cast out of your presence. It wasn't that God wasn't also present in the land of Nod, but the experience of his presence was different. Presence was different. And you see with Moses, when he comes to the burning bush, there's a special manifestation of God's presence at the burning bush, and God says, take off your shoes, this is holy ground. It's different in this moment in time, in this place. And when the Israelites are coming out of Egypt, it said the presence of the Lord goes before them in a pillar of fire by night and a cloud by day. It's a special manifestation of God's presence. It comes down on Mount Sinai when Moses receives the law. When Solomon finishes the temple, the presence of the Lord comes down in a special way, and it dwells in the temple, in the Holy of Holies, in a very unique and special way until Christ comes. And even Christ, he says, when 2 or 3 are gathered together in my name, I'm there with them. Doesn't mean that he's not around when we're by ourselves, but it's a special, unique manifestation of his presence. And this was understood by Jonah and the prophets. And when, the prophets, they talk about their service before God. When, Jeremiah and Elisha and Elijah, they talk about standing in his presence. Oftentimes it's referred to, the Lord which I serve. But the literal translation is the Lord who I stand before. Jonah had a very unique and special relationship with God, a special manifestation of his presence. God was working in a special way in Israel and through the temple, and Jonah wants to get away from this. And he goes to Tarshish, and Tarshish is very specific. Isaiah 66:19, it says, I will set a sign among them, and I will send some of those who survive to the nations, to Tarshish, to the Libyans, and to the Lydians, famous as archers, to Tubal in Greece, and to the distant islands that have not heard of my fame or seen my glory. God hadn't revealed himself to Tarshish in the way that he was revealing himself in Israel at the time. Jonah knows this. He understands this. He wants to get away from the experience of God's presence that he's familiar with because he doesn't want to be reminded that he's doing the wrong thing. He doesn't want to be reminded of his guilt and his shame. I have a really close friend who, like me, grew up in the church, and he had a very active faith and a strong faith, and I always admired his discipline. And shortly after college, he started dating this girl, and she's a very sweet girl, but she certainly wasn't a follower of Christ and isn't. And he knew that he shouldn't be in this relationship, but he just wanted it. And more, he kind of developed this conviction that he was meant to be with her, and as that relationship increased, he pushed God farther away. So he didn't have to feel like he was doing something wrong. He didn't want the reminder that this isn't what God wanted, so he pushed God away, and their relationship escalated. Eventually, they move in together, and my friend, he rejected God entirely, pushed God completely out of his life. And as I watched this happen, as I watched him push God away so he could kind of have the freedom to do what he wanted, it pointed out to me a very real and profound truth. When we choose our way over God's way, we're not just pushing God's will out of our lives, we are rejecting God. We are pushing God out of our lives. This is what Jonah does. He doesn't like God's way, so he pushes God out. Because he doesn't want to feel the shame, feel the guilt. And many of you might come from experiences and upbringings where guilt and shame were used to manipulate you. So the idea of getting away from guilt and shame sounds great. But I think we'd all agree that sometimes guilt and shame are necessary. If a husband cheats on his wife, hopefully he would regret this. Hopefully he would feel some sense of guilt. And if somebody stole your life savings, hopefully they would feel some remorse and guilt about it. If you're a country music lover, you should feel ashamed of that. Guilt and shame are appropriate at times. And Jonah was pushing them away. My friend was pushing them away because we wanted the freedom to do what they wanted, and they pushed God away. But the truth is, every time we choose our way over God's way, we are choosing our way over God himself. It's as if we're saying, God, I want my own way more than I want you. I want you to actually say that with me real quick. God, I want my own way more than I want you. All right, so I was doing this with VBS kids all week, and they had so much more energy whenever they say things. All right, we're going to try that one more time. God, imagine the next time you're confronted with a situation and you have to make the choice, am I going to do it God's way or am I going to do it my way? And you say, you know what, I'm going to do it my way. But before you do, just stop and actually verbalize this to God. Say, you know what, God, I want my own way more than I want you. Because this is what we're doing, even if we aren't thinking about it this way, even if we're not saying it. But if we say it, imagine having to say it to God, to come before him and say, God, you know what? I don't want you today. God, I want to have the freedom to sleep with whoever I want, whenever I want, more than I want you. God, I want my independence and my freedom, and I want to walk away from this marriage more than I want you in my life. God, I want the extra money in my pocket more than I want you. Sometimes, it doesn't need to be that extreme. For me, sometimes I get home and I say, God, I want an extra episode of Arrested Development more than I want to spend time in your word. I want TV more than I want you. I want my way more than I want you. Imagine if we actually said this to God every time we chose something over him. I think it might change the way we see our actions and our desires. As I said earlier, each week we're looking at the story of Jonah as a cautionary tale. And the caution for today is, if we choose something over God, you might get exactly what you want. If you run to Tarshish, you might actually get there. See, we look at the story of Jonah and we see the big storm and we see the big fish, and we see these as the reason to not flee from God, because who wants to get eaten and vomited by a whale? But the real tragedy would have been if Jonah made it all the way to Tarshish. Imagine if Jonah made it all the way and he had a nice, comfortable, long life in the affluence of Tarshish, never to hear from God again. See, when we choose something other than God, there's the distinct possibility that we're going to get exactly what we want. Jesus actually talks about it another way. In John 15, he gives this image to his disciples. He says, I'm a vine. Picture me as a vine, and you're all the branches coming off of this vine. I'm the life source. He says, so stay connected to me. Stay connected to the vine. If you cut the branch off, it's just going to wither and die. So he says to them, remain in me, and I will remain in you, and then you'll bear much fruit. Which, I'm not a big fruit guy, so I'm just like, why can't it be like bear much steak? That sounds so much cooler. But then I thought about it, and I realized it's not a tree, it's a vine with branches, which means he's talking about grapes, and grapes make wine. So it's cool again. All right, so he says, remain in me, and I'll remain in you, and then you will bear much fruit. And he said, it's fruit that will last. It's not just having a successful lifestyle. This isn't kind of the Joel Osteen version of, health, wealth, and happiness. He's talking about fruit that will last for eternity. That's what's so ironic about this story of Jonah. Jonah runs from God because he thinks he's doing something good. He thinks he knows better, and he flees. And the writer, he constantly talks about it going down, this downward spiral that Jonah's on. But he uses another word play in this story as well. There's this one word that is repeated over and over and over in the story of Jonah, and it's the Hebrew word gadol. Can you guys practice saying this a couple? Gadol? Gadol. And remember, it's Hebrew, so it's gadol. If you're not spitting on the person in front of you, you're not saying it right. So this word gadol, it means great. And the writer of the story of Jonah, he uses again and again, 14 times in this short little story, this idea of great. And every time it shows up, it's either in reference to what God is doing or what God is calling Jonah to. So it starts, and God calls Jonah to the great city of Nineveh. And Jonah goes down to Joppa and gets on a boat, and he goes down into the boat. And then God sends a great storm, and Jonah goes down into the sea. And then God sends a great fish, and Jonah goes down into the belly of the fish. And then Jonah is vomited. And he says, once again, go to the great city of Nineveh, to its great people. Everything God is doing and everything God is calling Jonah to is great. And Jonah trades all of that greatness in for some lesser dream, to hold on to his own convictions. And I want to ask you, are you trading in God's greatness for a lesser dream? And it might be a conviction that you've held on to since birth. It might be something you learned in college. It might be, who knows where it came from, but if it doesn't come from God's word, it's not a conviction worth holding. It might make your life fine. It might even make it good, but God is doing something great. Everything God does is always great, and everything God is calling you to is great, and there are greater things to come. And I know there are people in this room that even a year or two ago, you weren't even running from God. You were actually just living in Tarshish. God wasn't on your radar, and then something happened, and you started pursuing a relationship with God, and you've started to pursue this path of obedience. You see, when Jesus talks about the vine and the branches, he says, remain in me. But then he tells them how to remain in him, which is really helpful. It's not just a theological idea. He actually gives a practical. He says, now remain in my love. And he says, if you keep my commands, you will remain in my love. If you keep my commands, you'll remain in my love. This is how we're able to remain connected to the vine, to bear the fruit, to experience the greatness. It's this path of obedience that God is calling us to. So I ask you, are you going to choose this path of obedience? I've seen people do it, and even in a short time, I've heard their stories about the great things that God does in their life, the great things that God does through them as well. I hear your stories. It's amazing. And if you're one of these people that has been pursuing this and seeing this greatness, I just want to encourage you to keep it up. Don't stop now. Keep finding these pockets of disobedience, the pockets where our convictions aren't lining up with God's will, and keep rooting them out, because there's greater things to come. But for some of you, you haven't experienced this greatness. You don't even know that, what I'm saying is true or possible. But I promise you, there is a greatness in store for you. Holding on to your convictions, holding on to your way of doing life, how great has that made your life so far? How great will you say your life has been doing it your way? I just want to encourage you, give it a try. Try this path of obedience. Learn from the story of Jonah. Avoid the mistakes he made. Trade in these lesser dreams for the greatness of God. Choose this path of obedience. Let's pray. God, we are so grateful for your word, for your teaching, your guidance. And God, I pray that you will soften our hearts, that you will bring to mind those areas in our lives where we are rejecting your will and your way, so that we can do it our way, holding on to our convictions stubbornly. God, you are good, and what you're doing is great. And God, I pray that we will take this path of obedience so that we can participate in the great things that you are doing in us and through us. God, we love you so much, and we thank you for all these things. In Jesus' name, amen.